Welcome to Divorce Law with attorney David Badanes.
Welcome to Divorce Law with experienced attorney David Badanes. David has extensive experience in divorce, child custody, child support, divorce mediation, and more. David personally handles each client with the personalized attention they deserve. I'm your host, Sophia Morales, and today's episode is Divorce Mediation versus Litigation. Which path is right for you? Welcome, David. I'm so happy to have you on the show today.
Well, good morning. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with the basics. If someone's going through a divorce, what's the fundamental difference between going through a mediation or a litigation?
Well, mediation means that both parties go to a mediator. At least in New York State, that doesn't necessarily have to be an attorney, which always surprises people. But that person tries to get the two parties, the spouses, to agree to all the issues that are involved in a divorce. So they don't favor, let's say, husband and wife or husband and husband, whatever. They act, as I call it, as a quasi-judge, or at least they should, where they go through each issue involved in their particular divorce. And they, again, try to get the two couples to mediate or compromise or agree to each issue as they go along in the mediation sessions. I am a mediator as well, and I'm obviously an attorney. And I always advise people, if they're going to use a mediator, it should be an attorney. There are many mediators, as I mentioned before, at least in New York, that are not attorneys. And, they probably take a class, at least basically, on what mediation is, but they don't really know the nitty gritty, as I call it.
Yeah.
But when they use an attorney, since we know the law, as I said, we kind of act as a judge without having that title, of course, but we know what the courts are going to do if they went to court. But they can certainly deviate or agree to whatever. There's a lot more flexibility in mediation than if going to court. And in most parts, the divorcing couple, can agree to many things that may not happen in court, so to speak. So
Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, I can give you lots of examples. but let's say, just for argument's sake, according to the child support formula, one party is supposed to pay $1,000 a month to the other party. But for whatever reasons, and there could be a million reasons, they say, you know what, we'll agree to $500 a month or zero or whatever. And as long as both parties agree to it and understand why, and in the agreement we may have to put why, that is just one of many examples of something that we can do in mediation that most likely, judges, they kind of stick to the formula or very close to the formula. And again, there's exceptions to that rule, but that's one very good example.
Okay. And what if you're headed down the litigation path?
Well, as most people sort of know in seeing movies and TV, and I always tell them that's not really how it goes anyway, but the issue with going to divorce is it's going to be a heck of a lot more expensive, a heck of a lot longer. And no matter how much they try to be amicable, it can sometimes lead to ugliness. So, and again, mediation is not for everybody. It really isn't. I always tell people to call, and it's usually one person, not both. I say, is your spouse on board with this? Is there domestic violence? Is there something that you're really not agreeing on? I tell people that, they have to act like adults, get along in the sandbox, so to speak. Doesn't mean they come here agreeing to things. I don't expect that, but
Right.
that they can talk like adults and at least listen with two ears and, understand that they're there to compromise. And they're not going to get everything they want, and they have to be able to listen.
So if somebody's not certain which is the right path for them, would you recommend starting with mediation and then switching if it's not working, or do you have to kind of pick a path and stick with it?
Well, I'm not too sure I'd view that way, but I think you probably kind of know.
Okay.
You kind of know just in your gut if this is something that can be mediated. I have people call me and they say, I want to do mediation because they want to save money and they want to save time. But when I ask them a bunch of questions, first one almost always is domestic violence. If the answer to that is yes, then I say, look, I'm not the guy for you, and you shouldn't be doing mediation, number one. And even if it's not, quote unquote, physical violence, if there's a lot of bullying or some party tries to manipulate the other party, I also say, no, this is not going to work. And then if, when I talk to the person, I can usually tell in 2 minutes or whatever that it's not the right path for them just from what they say. So if they want to try to call a mediator, and hopefully that mediator is like me where they ask questions, not just take any client, they'll know. The mediator will know. But again, I really think the clients kind of know if mediation's the right path because they know if there's just too much acrimony between the couples, that it's just not going to work.
Let's say we've passed all of those hurdles and the answer to all those questions is positive and we can move forward. What should you expect during a divorce mediation session? How does this get structured?
Sure. So similar to a divorce, we will need documentation, income tax returns, W-2s, bank statements, credit card statements. Probably not to the same extent in a divorce, but the mediator is going to need to know the financials of both parties. So that's one thing they're gonna have to expect. And at least in my mediation sessions, we go through one issue at a time and I tell them that, look, nothing's final until it's final, meaning until you sign something. And what I do is after each session, I send them a summary of what we talked about and a summary of what I call their homework, meaning, look, we talked about, for example, without giving names, I'll talk about what I just did a mediation last night. They're deciding they own their own home and they own a summer home, for example. And we're talking about what do they want to do with both homes, sell them, one party stay, et cetera, et cetera. So we went through those issues, but we didn't really get to a resolution per se because that's a big issue and they needed to think about it. So in my email today, in my summary, I say, well, this is what we talked about. Here's some of the alternatives that we talked about. Why don't you think about it more and we'll talk about it in the next session. So those are the kind of things they should expect, going through each issue. And some issues are very simple, or not simple, are easily resolved, I should say, and some are not. So that's why it usually takes 3 to 5 sessions, I say, and usually a little bit more if there's kids, to go through all the sessions.
And so how far apart are sessions usually spaced? Is this like a weekly process or?
I try to do mine every week, but sometimes I go every 2 weeks because clients are not good at doing homework. And they're terrible at doing homework. So I try not to go more than 2 weeks, but I also really try every week. It just gets the process rolling along. And again, it fits that whole thing of mediation takes a lot less time.
So if you were to compare the time that it takes for mediation versus a litigated divorce, how does that kind of shake out?
Oh, well, forgetting about the court delay, because that's built in. But a mediation could take, let's say, if it's 5 sessions, so it's basically 5 weeks plus that. So we're talking about 2 months before, well, maybe 2.5 months before I get to file everything in the court system. And then it's out of my hands in terms of how long the clerk takes it. Versus even a simple divorce in court, 6 months, 8 months, a year, so that the time frame is, greatly enhanced in a divorce situation.
Right. So are there any situations in which mediation is simply not an option? You mentioned some screening questions.
Right. I mentioned domestic violence, or when there's manipulation, lying. A lot of times when there's quote unquote cheating, because one person's just too angry at the other person. I forgot to mention, but again, if one party owns a business, because a lot of times there's too much hidden cash, and I'm not a forensic accountant, unlike in a court, we can get a forensic accountant or more information about the person's business. So those are typically when it's not a good candidate for mediation.
Good. And how do the costs? Yeah.
Oh, one more thing. I'm sorry. One more. If there's also alcohol or drug abuse.
Sure. Yeah, I could see that. So we compared kind of the timeline. How do the costs typically compare when you're talking mediation versus a litigated divorce?
Again, you're saving thousands and thousands of dollars. At least in my firm, I don't really know what other mediators do. When I do a mediation, each session is a guarantee, a set fee. And then when I draft the divorce agreement, again, it's a set fee. We don't know, we may not know how many sessions, but again, I can tell them pretty much a range, so they can probably predict how much that's going to cost them within a small range. While in a contested divorce or any kind of divorce in court, who knows how many times you're going to be in court and how many hours and this and that. But your savings probably tens of thousands of dollars.
That's good to know. So We kind of brushed up against this one earlier as well. If you start with mediation and it just goes to pieces, is litigation still an option?
Yes, I have a very good track record because I do ask those initial questions, and I don't take mediations if I believe it's not going to work. I want the couples to be successful, because otherwise it's a waste of everybody's time and money. But if a mediation does not work, absolutely they can go to a contested divorce.
Excellent. So what advice would you give someone who's pondering, separating and comparing these options to determine which process is best?
Kind of like what we said before, if they think that their spouse and them can, like I said, behave like adults, compromise, and there's not these issues we talked about, they certainly can call up a mediator and then talk to the mediator about that. And again, if it's a good mediator, they'll let them know if they think they're a good candidate for a successful mediation.
One little follow-up question for you. You mentioned earlier that there are non-attorney mediators and attorney mediators. What kind of trouble could you get into going down that road with a non-attorney mediator?
Right. And I don't like to, talk bad about other people, so I won't mention names, of course. But I have seen agreements drawn up by non-attorneys, and they do like a very broad brush, so to speak, but they don't necessarily get into some of the nitty gritty, or they just get the law wrong. And so the agreement that they draft is really not sufficient. It has too much ambiguity, too many loose ends, et cetera, et cetera. Even when I do mediation, I tell the couple they should have another attorney at the end of the process, almost before they sign, to review the agreement with them. The reason I do that, I say, look, I'm going to review the agreement, but you may want another voice to again, because look, there's so much to go through. I said your head's going to be spinning no matter what. So if you talk to another person, not to renegotiate, but just to kind of explain it again in a different voice, so to speak, it's always good to have an attorney review the agreement, your own attorney. So I've served in that role many times, where people have gone to a mediator and they need somebody to double check it, if you want to use that word. Yeah. And like I said, when I've seen these from non-attorneys, they're not great. Let's just put it that way.
Not great.
And I try not to, renegotiate, but I would tell them that these are issues that you may want to address again.
All right. Well, that's excellent advice. I really appreciate the insight that you've brought to this. Thanks for joining us on Divorce Law with attorney David Badanes. To connect with David, visit dbnylaw.com and make sure to like, subscribe, and leave a review.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to hit that like and subscribe button and leave us a review in the comments.